Hello, Elder Smith here. Today I'd like to continue where we left off in Genesis, starting in the 17th chapter. And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared unto Abram, and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me, and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee, in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession will I be, and I will be their God. And God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant, which ye shall keep, between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generations. He that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed, he that is born in thy house and he that is bought with money must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. Now, before I continue, I would like to bring up something really quick. The question was presented to me, and it is a bit of a bold question, but it's also a good question. Sometimes bold questions are good to ask, depending on how they are asked, and he asked it in a respectful manner. He said he understood that circumcision was supposed to be a mark left on the body of the show that you were one of God's people in the Old Testament as part of the covenant. But why that part of the body? Why was that spot right there supposed to be the where the mark was supposed to be left? And that right there is actually a good question, and I'll explain to you why. I believe everything God did in the Old Testament and everything he commanded in the Old Testament has a spiritual meaning in the New Testament, and we live in the New Testament times. The circumcision of the flesh is supposed to be a mark showing that people are separated from the Gentiles of the world, and they are a part of God's people, and that is the mark proving it. However, God has made it quite clear that public nakedness is is actually sinful and shameful both. Now, when someone is circumcised of the flesh, because they are concealed with clothing, you cannot tell who is circumcised and who is uncircumcised when you're out in public and they happen to cross your line of sight, because it is concealed. It's something personal. It is something that is between you and God and you and God alone. And just like you can't tell because they are concealed with clothing, likewise, the Bible mentions that in the New Testament that it's not the circumcision of the flesh that's important, but the circumcision of the heart, the spiritual heart, which is what happens when God touches your heart and pours His Spirit out over you. That right there is the spiritual circumcision. But just as you can't tell who is circumcised of the flesh just by looking at them out in public, you cannot go to a crowded area and necessarily tell who God has poured their Spirit out onto and who He hasn't. You can't tell who has received that spiritual circumcision because it's inside, not on the outside. It's not there for everybody to see. That's why Jesus said, "You shall know them by their fruits." You got to be able to see the fruits they bear. You can't see them by their appearance, by their physical appearance, but by the fruits they bear. Ye shall know if they are of the spiritual circumcision or not. And that is what the circumcision of the flesh represents. In fact, that's why the circumcision of the flesh was so important in the Old Testament, but is now no longer a requirement in the New Testament. For God doesn't look upon the outward man, He looks upon the inward man. If He has touched your heart and has poured His Spirit out over you, you are circumcised in the heart, and it doesn't matter if you're circumcised in the flesh or not. That spiritual mark is an eternal mark, and that's what's important. And I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, and kings of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, and that is 90 years old, bear? So Abraham's reached a point where he knows God is telling the truth. But this is so amazing because he and his wife are both elderly at this point in time. And we have reached the point in the scriptures where people don't live as long as they used to live. Their lifespan has declined significantly. Where people used to live to be around 900, now we've reached a point where the age they're at now is considered old. And that's why he started to laugh. And because there is a point where as we all know, there is a point where when a couple reaches a certain age, they can no longer bear children. And the fact of the matter is, under normal circumstances, Sarah is well past that age. Under normal circumstances, it is physically impossible for her to bear children. Under normal circumstances. But God, as we know, is intervening. He is changing this. He is showing that whatever He promises, logic cannot undo His promises. When He says something will be done and He has established it will be done, you can rest assured it will be done. And Abraham said unto God, O that Ishmael might live before thee. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time, and in the next year. And he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. And Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the selfsame day, as God had said unto him. And Abraham was 90 years old and 9 when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. In the selfsame day was Abraham circumcised, and Ishmael his son, and all the men of his house, born in the house and bought with money, of the stranger were circumcised with him. Now, I would like to point out a small detail. I won't explain it completely because this isn't really the time to do it. But I will expand upon it on a later video. Now, the fact of the matter is, when God made his promise to Abraham that that his seed would be God's people, and that God would be their God, he made that promise before the covenant of circumcision and not after. Now, is that important? Oh, it is. It is very important. And that actually is why circumcision is no longer a requirement in the New Testament. And it is actually pointed out in the New Testament how the promise was made before circumcision, lest people should say, well, because that Abraham was circumcised first and then he became one of God's people, and thus all his seed must to this very day be circumcised. No, God was with Abraham before the circumcision, and he established his promise with Abraham before the circumcision. Then the covenant came about. But that's all I'll touch on for today. This was a short video, but I believe this chapter here is a lot to take in. So I hope all of you that watch this video and hear these words, I hope you receive a blessing from him. And I hope God continues to reveal the truth to you and guide you in the way that pleases him the most. Anyways, remember the study, to show thyself approved, rightfully dividing the word of truth. Put on the whole armor of God and fight the good fight.